Today we're here for Angela. Angela Bobier grew up in Wallacestown within the heart of the Talbot settlement and has a diploma in cultural resource management from the University of Victoria. Angela's work background is in retail and direct sales, team building, customer service, and marketing. In 2009, she was elected to the Tyrconnell, I'm probably butchered that, Heritage Society Board of Directors and held the positions of membership and marketing chairperson, Education Day chairperson, vice president, and president before taking on the staff role of cultural manager in June 2012. Angela was given the title of executive director in 2022, her 10th anniversary at the museum. So congratulations, Angela. So I'm going to get my slides off here and turn it over to you.
Okay. Is it working?
Give me 1 second. Yes.
Sure.
Yes, I see your slide up on the live stream, so perfect.
Fantastic. Okay. Yes, it's Tyrconnell. Tyrconnell Heritage Society. They're the operators of the museum. So, of course, we can't talk about anything in this area without talking about Thomas Talbot. So it was great when I reached out to Tom, and my initial offer was to talk for 2 or 3 minutes about one of our artifacts. And when he looked at our website, realized, oh, well, a lot of people don't know about the Talbot settlement, Colonel Talbot. So now we're here for a full length talk. And I wanted to start with a quote, which is how I got the title of the talk today. But it was of the concern of a benevolent despot who believed that he had a divine mandate to rule in the best interests of the people. And this is about Thomas Talbot. So he really did think that he was able to rule over the best interests of the people. And I will come back to this picture again. We'll talk about the portrait. And if it's not in my slides later, we'll come back to that. So let's just make sure we can get to the next slide. There we go. So before we start, history does not start when Colonel Talbot shows up here. Obviously, we have the land that's the traditional territory of our First Nations peoples. We are settler focused at Bacchus Page House Museum, and we are working actively on not being as settler focused. So hopefully that comes in the next few years, because we value the historical and contemporary contributions of all the original peoples. And in our area, you can see, I don't know if I move this area here, hopefully you can see my cursor. A lot of people would know that as the neutral nation. And from University of Western Ontario and Guelph, they've come to name them the Chonanton. That's what they think is what the First Nations in the area would have called themselves. So that's the area that we're in, of course, on the north shore of Lake Erie. And again, I want to make it clear, because I always start with Colonel Talbot, we know that there was history well before Talbot arrives and the settlers. So, and I am not the person to tell that story. I think that should be from some of our First Nations peoples in our area. And you can see on the map on the right, we've got Moravian of the Thames is, we call them one of our neighbors, and Chippewa of the Thames, Oneida Nation, Munsee, Delaware. So those are the 4 current groups in our area. So the Talbot name really has been an honored name among the English nobility since Richard Talbot, that you can see here. A Norman knight, he settled in England during the reign of William the Conqueror. And a century later, there was another Richard Talbot who left England to assist King Henry II. And they were asserting their authority in Ireland. In 1174, as a reward, Richard got a royal grant of the fief of Malahide, and you're going to hear Malahide quite a bit today, where he built a castle on a limestone elevation beside the Irish Sea. And the Talbots were one of the longest families to inhabit one area and castle in Ireland, because they've had ancestral land since the 12th century. And of course, Earl of Tyrconnell, and as you heard, we are Tyrconnell Heritage Society. So clearly we've used a lot of the names from Ireland in this area. So this is Malahide Castle. There's a drawing on the left, and then a more current picture on the right. If you've ever been to London, Ontario, to the old courthouse, it will look similar. So the courthouse in London is actually modeled after Colonel Talbot's ancestral home, which is seen here, Malahide Castle. And that's where he was born. It's near Dublin, or just outside the city limits. He was born on July 19th of 1771. He's the fourth son in a family of 12 children, and his parents were Sir Richard Talbot and Lady Margaret O'Reilly Talbot. Because he's the fourth son, Thomas would have to make his own way in the world. Of course, the oldest son inherits everything, and then all the other sons have to figure out how to make their way. Thomas spent his childhood at the castle, and he was among the highest ranks of nobility. So even though they're in Ireland, they're very connected to the British monarchy, aristocracy, nobility. So those are the classes that he would have associated with. He was educated in his early years in Malahide, and then later went to Manchester Free School in England. Now, as the fourth son, he begins his military career. That's just what you had to do. He starts with the 66th Regiment of Foot at age 11. So just before he turns 12, he's sent to the military. And I don't know any parents, well, there might be some parents now who'd like to do that, but you certainly can't send your kids off just before they turn 12 to the military. 3 weeks after signing, after the signing of the treaty that ended the Revolutionary War in the United States, Thomas would advance to the rank of lieutenant, and then he decided to retire with half pay at the age of 13. And I know that I would have maybe liked to retire at half pay at age 13 as well. And I'm sure there's some people listening who think that might be a good deal. From 1786 to 1788, Talbot is the aide-de-camp to a distant relative of his, and that is the first Marquis of Buckingham, who's also the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. And that gentleman's name was George Nugent Temple Grenville, quite the long name. So this meant that Talbot was in the environment of the Dublin court of the British monarchy. And they were kind of his benefactors. So that's how you got anywhere in life. And honestly, it's the same now. It's who you know, who your connections are, networking, and that's exactly what he did. So Talbot first comes to Canada, at the time it'd be Upper Canada, in the spring of 1790 at the age of 21. When he sailed, he joins his regiment, and by then he's with the 24th Regiment of Foot, and they're doing garrison duty in Quebec, which is actually, he was in Montreal. So our settlement, of course, is named after him. He becomes private secretary to John Graves Simcoe. And at that point, John Graves Simcoe is the lieutenant governor of Upper Canada, and that happens in 1792. So Talbot stays with Simcoe for about 4 years. He accompanies him on different travels throughout Upper Canada, and that's where his idea of founding a settlement happens. And so we actually have a map here. It's not the greatest map ever, but it does show some of their journeys from March of 1793 to September of 1795. And they're all along the north shore of Lake Erie, but they're using the Thames River and the lake. So it's kind of a circuitous route. If anyone wants to see the map in a better light, I can certainly, maybe we can post it somewhere on the History Symposium website, but it is available online. So on one of Simcoe and Talbot's trips, of course, they're with other people. It's not just the two of them. They go to where Simcoe later planned to establish his capital. And Simcoe thought the capital of Upper Canada should be London, Ontario, at the forks of the Thames. And of course, that didn't happen. York, which is now Toronto, that does become the provincial capital of Ontario. But on this trip, Talbot would see the land that one day would become the Talbot settlement, and the idea of founding his own colony starts to percolate in his mind. So he sees a few areas there and ends up, oh, we're skipping one, sorry. And he just this keeps percolating with him. And of course, on the left is a portrait of John Grace Simcoe. Now, Thomas has to go back with the military. He gets sent back to Europe. So he's in the battlefields of Holland and Germany. He's fighting the French in the 85th Regiment of Foot as a captain in the Duke of York's army. And the following year, he's promoted to lieutenant colonel in the 5th Regiment of Foot in England. And then after about 5 years, he sells his commission, just Christmas Day, abruptly sells it. It sounds like he didn't really talk to anyone. He just went ahead and did it. And that's 1800. So I think he was starting the year out with his new ideas. Because of his rank and all the connections that he's made, he had a lot of influence within the British aristocracy and then the provincial governments of different colonies. So for instance, he had a really intimate friendship with Francis Gore, who's the 3rd Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, along with his wife and staff, and they treated him like family. And there's recurring roles where he befriends the wives and the children of different people, and he becomes family members to them. And this happens quite often. So he is featured, since you were just having a group of talks about the Napoleonic War. We've got a little spot for Colonel Talbot being there as well. So Talbot applied to the monarchy to get a grant of land in what used to be Yarmouth Township in our Elgin County along the shore of Lake Erie. It was already taken. So he did have to choose a different township, and he does. He ends up here in Dunwich, so thankfully he did that. But because it was already taken, he actually got to choose. They didn't just assign him another one. They let him pick something else. So the settlers he placed on the land were supposed to be from Europe or the United States. He had 5,000 acres, and he had promised that he'd use it for agriculture, specifically cultivating hemp, because they were needing hemp for sailcloth, cordage, paper, lamp oil, and he seemed to be an authority on the subject of hemp. He'd inspected the soil along the north shore of Lake Erie with this endeavor in mind, and that was while he was on that trip with Simcoe. So he was always thinking ahead. His thought was that the 5,000 acres would provide for 100 families, and there would be a maximum of 20,000 acres for Talbot's own benefit. So he gathered 4 others that he hired in York, which is now Toronto, Corporal William Powers, Patrick Wheeland, George Crane, who was a retired British Army officer and one of our early settlers, and a Samuel Rogers, and he hired a survey crew headed by William Hambley, who was the deputy surveyor. By May 31st of 1802, Talbot had hired William Caffrey, and there was a few other people with him that came just after May 21st of 1803. So he hired some carpenters from Niagara who had apprentices, and then he hired a housekeeper, because of course he wasn't going to do all of his own work. And then he writes in his papers that on May 21st of 1803, he takes possession of Dunwich, and that's our Dunwich Township that our museum is in. And I've included a map here that is actually from 1813, but you can see in 10 years how he's taken what was nothing when he shows up in 1803, and at the, I'll use my cursor, at the entrance to Talbot Creek, there's a fort. So I would assume they put the fort in as things were leading downhill towards the War of 1812. And all the way up the creek, by this time they've got a distillery, a mill, there's a bridge, there's some houses and offices and a barn, and that's Malin Burwell's first farm. And he ends up being Colonel Talbot's right-hand man. And then a mill pond, there's a dam. So they've really, in 10 years, put this all together. And this section here is the outhouse, main house, storehouse. They've got a blacksmith, poultry, and a barn. So it doesn't take long if you've got help to put together the start of a settlement. And they've got a road which goes to the lake settlement that has since fallen into the lake, and then a road to the upper settlement, which is probably the original Fingal line, if anyone's from this area. So the first water mill we had was put up at Talbot's own expense. He does pay for that. And It's said to have been working in 1808, and we'll get to what happens to it when I talk a bit about the War of 1812. After the completion of the sawmills that they have here in this section, since no settlers had come yet, Talbot invited the First Nations who were in the area to celebrate the completion. And it said in some of the different books that they actually adopted him as a member of their tribe. And I wish it had said which particular First Nations group that was, but it doesn't. And I'm hoping at some point someone will be able to tell us. I've got a picture, it's a painting of the interior of what Colonel Talbot's house may have looked like. So we've got the, the large hearth, because you're probably cooking on that. We've got a map here on the left, and we'll talk more about maps in a minute. On their trip to get to Port Talbot to settle, their small boat was called the Mayflower. So clearly he was enamored and interested in when the first British settlers arrived in the United States on the Mayflower. He and his employees erected a log house, and it was on the hill and it faced the lake. So the backs, should the house still be standing, the back of it would be to the road that we have now. The log home had 3 rooms. He had a storeroom, a sitting room, and his kitchen for his housekeeper. It was said that the house was not beautiful. It was utilitarian, but the view that he had would have been beautiful. He called the log cabin Castle Malahide. So he did have very high thoughts of himself, what his settlement was going to be like. But Talbot was a simple man. And in a lot of words of the settlers, Talbot baked his own bread. He milked his own cows. He made his own butter and cheese, washed his own clothes, ironed and dressed his own linen. And I assume he learned a lot of that being in the military to do for himself. But he did have some interesting habits as well. He could be very grumpy, a curmudgeon, some would say, and not always welcoming. He did like to drink, and you had to catch him on the right day in a good mood if you wanted to talk to him. And that was what the settlers found, of course, when they started arriving. So Thomas Talbot, he is an Irish Anglican aristocrat with the 5,000 acres. And that's just the south part of Dunwich and our neighbors, Aldborough Township. So after they've built everything, he also supervised construction of a 300-mile road, which paralleled the lake. And he put all the settlers there. So when you came to Colonel Talbot, you, again, have to catch him on the right day. And if you were English or Irish, he would put you nearish to him, and that would be along the lake. If you were Scottish, there was very much a class system that he brought here from England and Ireland, and he just didn't like Scottish people. And he would put you in North Dunwich or just in the next township, which is Aldborough. But all the settlers had the same rules in order to get your actual land deed. So within 3 years of arriving, or him putting you in pencil on his map, you had to build a house at least 16 by 20 feet, and you had to live in it. And there is reason for that, which I'll get to. You declare the road allowance across the front of your acreage. You declare and fence 5 acres of crops. And then you also had to cut the large trees that were a chain length, which is a surveyor's chain, which would be 66 feet from the road. And the point of that is he had actually seen other settlements that gave land away for clergy reserves, specifically to the Anglican Church. And of course, no one ever lived on them. And you might have a farm and then a bunch of clergy reserves and then nothing else, and then another farm. And there were no road systems. And being in the military, he knew how important roads were. So he wanted his settlers right beside each other. And that's how we have such a great road system in the area. He didn't want to have people not living on their farms, also for the same reason. So that's why you had to build your house and occupy it. If you didn't do the settler duties, he would erase you off the map because you were only written in pencil, and give your land to someone else. And there were a lot of hard feelings, and that's to put it mildly. There were a lot of destitute people who were removed off their land and it was given to someone else because they didn't get all of these things done. It could have been for sickness. There could be any reason that someone didn't complete all their settler duties, but it didn't matter. He did not, as far as I know, give extensions. He just removed you because he had a goal for roadways, for a settlement, and he just wasn't willing to take the chance that somebody wouldn't do what he needed them to do. The other thing he did, though, is depending on what time of year you arrive to take your land, you may go into training. He would keep you on at the Talbot estate and get you used to the climate. You would work there for a while, and he would teach you how to run the farm, clear the land, because a lot of people coming as settlers really didn't know. They might have come from a city. So he was benevolent. He did want people to succeed, and he had really high standards, but he was willing to also put in the work there. And I do have a picture there. Most people had oxen, if they had any livestock at all when they first got here. Horses were very uncommon in our area. They're not great for farming when you're in a deciduous forest and you're farming around tree stumps. So this isn't the great picture for showing the amount of trees we would have here, but the oxen are bang on. It's not like in Little House on the Prairie where there's nothing for miles and miles and miles and you can just start plowing with no prep work. This was all forest, very dense, or marshes, which you couldn't farm in at all. So people were just cutting down trees, and it could take 7 years to get rid of a stump. So you just farmed around it so you could feed yourself those first few years and get that 5 acres in. I can't skip the War of 1812 because Talbot is part of that, and it does interrupt the settlement plan. He's arrived in 1803. A few settlers have come, but this does interrupt completely his plans. So in 1812, Major General Sir Isaac Brock, senior officer commander of the troops, and he's also the senior member of the Executive Council, puts Thomas Talbot in charge of the 1st Middlesex Militia, and he's the supervisor of all the militia in the London district, which was made up of Middlesex, Norfolk, and Oxford. So he is the commander. These troops do take part at the Battle of Lundy's Lane and at Fort George, and I know we have a lot of reenactors listening to the talk, so you're familiar with those. Now, there is a story about the near death or capture of Colonel Talbot, which I will share. Since he is the commanding officer, he would be somebody that you want to capture. The thought was if you took him out of the game, people would be demoralized. It would be an interruption in command, in messages getting through. So they wanted to capture him. Now, it is 1812, so there's no wanted posters. Nobody knows what he looks like. And he narrowly escaped from a raiding enemy party. So the colonel actually tells a story to Edward Ermatinger. And while he's at his home, Port Talbot, he notices on the horizon that there's a First Nations scout. He invited them in for drinks. And then several more came. He invited them in for drinks to his house. And then when the entire First Nations raiding party appeared on the horizon and he motioned for them to come to his house, he then jumps into a ravine where he knew he wouldn't be seen from the woods by the rest of the group. I think he was willing to have 3 or 4 people in his house and then realized, oh, we have a problem. There's an entire really large group of people. So he proceeds to climb. He hides among the branches of nearby trees. And while he's hiding in the tree and he's laying deathly still, the First Nations are congregating around the very tree, but they don't realize that Colonel Talbot is up there. They exchange a bunch of words, they venture off, and they keep looking for Colonel Talbot. There's many accounts of the same story. So some of them are that he doesn't just climb up the tree. He's seen from far away. He's never in a military uniform. He's dressed as a shepherd, and someone says, "Oh, ignore him. He's deaf, can't hear. He's just the shepherd." And he gets away and walks 3 days to Turkey Point. So there's variations of all these little stories. But the point is, he does get away every time. And we never know which one is actually true and which story is just embellished a little bit. But again, if you never dress in your uniform, they don't realize that you're maybe the big catch that they should get. So in 1812, there's difficulties in recruiting the first militias because there aren't really a lot of men here. But Talbot does figure out from the 3 townships how to get 350 men. And there's a small fleet of boats that dock at Port Talbot to transport all the volunteers. And that's on August 10th. So by August 16th, they participate with Brock and they actually recapture Fort Detroit. And there are quite a few local men buried in St. Peter's, which I've listed here because I think they deserve to be honored. We did honor them in 2015 with 1812 plaques. So they're on the Veterans of 1812 website. So of course we have Colonel Thomas Talbot, but we have Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Patterson, Captain Gilman Wilson, George Crane, John Pierce, Stephen Backus, and Walter Story, who are 4 of our settlers along where we have the museum. And then Captain Malin Burwell, who is a surveyor in this area and Colonel Talbot's right-hand man. He's buried a little bit farther away at St. Stephen's Anglican Cemetery. And there's a little watercolor here, just an example of what potentially Port Talbot looked like when they were camped there and waiting to head to Fort Detroit. So the biggest thing to happen in the Talbot settlement during the War of 1812 actually happens in 1814. And that is MacArthur's raids. So in February, the center of control for this area is Talbot's farm. It's got the port. It does have the community that surrounds the mills, the shops, and the farms. And that's why they want to capture not only Talbot, but they want to get rid of that entire settlement. So it becomes the target. And this is the first raid that happens in February, and that's led by Captain Holmes. And his intention is to attack Port Talbot, but it's February. So you can imagine what the roads are horrible sometimes here now in February. But in 1814, when there aren't a lot of roads, it would be horrible. But also they get a lot of resistance from the Talbot area militia. They abandon their plan, and instead they go to Delaware and attack 20 Mile Creek along the Longwoods Road. And then consequently, the British abandon Delaware. And then that makes Port Talbot the next objective. So I think that's February, March in 1814. By May, we're attacked by 30 riflemen, and that's under the command of Andrew Westbrook. And he's got a group of deserters from the Talbot settlement. He was one of the settlers near Delaware. And instead of siding with the British, he decides to settle with his original home, the United States. He wants to capture Talbot, but Talbot happens to be in Long Point at the time, which is great. But he left Malin Burwell in charge, who we mentioned, buried in St. Stephen's Cemetery. Burwell hears rumors, but when raiders arrive, because he heard rumors, he'd abandoned Port Talbot. So instead they keep marching and they go to what's now St. Thomas. And we'll talk more about that part a little bit later. We are raided multiple times. So there's another raid in July. There's another raid in August. So just over and over, different waves of Americans coming here. And the governor of Michigan said to MacArthur, create a desert between us and them. And the goal was to burn all the mills, all the food stores, and basically just starve everybody out into giving up. So there's a lot of battle of, I think it's Malcolm's Mill, there's a lot of mills that they get rid of. And that's the whole point, is if you can't mill your grain, you can't have bread, you can't have food. So that's their entire goal in that 1814 era. And you can see on the map where they just make a circle. They leave Detroit, they get to Moraviantown, which is the Battle of the Thames, Oxford, Burford, right? They come down, and then they come down through the Talbot settlement, which is this area here where it's red. They do quite a bit of property damage, and they will take everything. They'll empty your mattress and put anything you own, clothes, tools, candlesticks, everything. They'll put it in there and take it with you. They would destroy the crops. And in this area, the oldest man, and I use that loosely, here in our little section of Little Ireland, is 12. One of the Pierce boys is the oldest male left, and he is left a gun, and he is in charge of protecting, you know, the few families that are here, the women and the children. They do take some people prisoner, and Malin Burwell ends up in Ohio at some point. So I think the biggest one is in August, on August 16th. I think that's the biggest raid that we have here. And their point was they could ask a high ransom for Thomas Talbot. And they wanted to, again, sweep through the settlement and take everything. Talbot is in residence this time in August and narrowly escapes. So Captain Leslie Patterson happens to be with him at his home and tells him to run out the back door. And this is the time that he's dressed as a settler. He's in his farm clothes, he's got on an old hat, he takes his staff, he walks slowly towards the ravine, and then he is seen, and one of the raiders aims at him with his musket. And thankfully, Patterson seizes the musket, pushes it up, and then uses the story of the old shepherd. And they believed him. I mean, there's no wanted posters, so Talbot remains a free man. They do take all his livestock and carry off any valuables that he's got. The wily Talbot, though, and that is another, besides curmudgeon, they do say he's wily, he'd hidden 2-quart pots of gold plate under the front of his house, which nobody discovered. So people were hiding their valuables underground quite a bit. Now, Captain Malin Burwell doesn't fare as well during this raid. He's actually sick at home with the ague, similar to malaria, and that was very common in Upper Canada. And the raiders take everything in his house. They destroy the buildings. He's forced to walk to Ohio and remains there until he's paroled December 21st, 1814. His family has to seek shelter from someone else in the settlement. And he is later compensated for his time in captivity, but probably not very well. And along with this, at some point, this would be the only time it's happened, St. Thomas ended up for one night under the flag of the US. Now, it wasn't St. Thomas yet. It was actually Daniel Rappelgee's farm. So I've got the plaque there. Daniel's from New York. And his farm, if anyone's been to St. Thomas and Jumbo the elephant is up on the hill, that was Daniel Rappelgee's farm. And they attack there, and you can see on the left, I've got everything he claimed that they took. So he had a fantastic working farm, lots of activity, very rich according to 1814 standards. This is everything that they used or took while they were there, and then flew the American flag over his farm. And we've got a picture there. This isn't actually from the St. Thomas battle, but it is MacArthur's. It's called MacArthur's Gamble, that painting there. So they did a lot of damage, and they did almost starve people. Some people did starve, luckily not in our area, but it was very, very difficult. You can imagine if you've arrived in 1809 or 1810 as a new settler, now you've been through the War of 1812, and you still really haven't established your farm yet. Okay, I've lost my cursor. There it is. Okay. So I've got some paintings here of the left is Talbot's house again. And after the War of 1812, the Talbot settlement starts to develop rapidly, along with the rest of Upper Canada, actually. So Talbot would deal with his land applicants through the window of his house. And because he was punched once, probably more than once, but there is a story of a settler not liking the interaction he had with Talbot, because he used to invite you into his house when you would ask for land. And it didn't go well. He was assaulted. And from then on, he would do business through his window. So I actually call it the drive-through land grant system, because that's how he was running things. When the window was closed, you just had to wait. So you just have to wait around his property, hope he didn't let the dogs loose on you. If he didn't approve of the applicant, he would just slam his window shut. And it could be as simple as, you know, just his attitude that day, or there's no reason for why he didn't like someone. He just had a feeling, but he just slammed the door shut. And the person who manhandled Colonel Talbot was a Highlander named Duncan Patterson. Mr. Patterson held him on the ground until he was promised his desired location for land. And once that happened, then the colonel was a little more cautious, and he would have his personal servant, Jeffrey Hunter, like I said, release the dogs once Talbot rejected some applicants. He was also infamous for writing his settler names on the settlement map in pencil, which I mentioned before. If he was displeased with you or you didn't complete your settler duties, he would just erase your name from the map. And you actually didn't have your deed until you completed those settler duties, paid the fee, and then you actually got your paperwork. So until there's some people who lived on their farm, worked it for 10 years before they actually had in hand some kind of paperwork. We do have here in the museum a Colonel Talbot room, and in that we've got at least 2 land deeds framed, and they're hung up for people to see, one from Dunwich and one from Aldborough, and they're signed by Colonel Talbot, and so you can certainly see those there. And as you'll notice on my slide, unfortunately, Talbot's house was demolished in 1997. And I would say that is because there was no municipal heritage committee, and they in the province didn't designate the house. Over the years, of course, the house had been added on to, but still the main section in the center was Talbot's house. The Talbot estate, all the land has been cut up into different parcels, and people are living on it, but the house is gone. So that is, it's still a sore subject in the area. But we do now have a municipal heritage committee, which is great. So we are designating properties. So this is probably my favorite map. In the late 1700s and early 1800s that we've been talking about here in Upper Canada, the whole area, and this isn't just Upper Canada, but the whole area was growing rapidly. Settling here was a long and strenuous job. Like I mentioned, we've got forests, marshes, rocks. Clearing land was horrible to plant crops in. And then there's geographical challenges, and you had to deal with rough weather. So long, harsh winters, hot summers, and the Talbot settlement is a large area, which I think surprises most people. And partly that may be my fault, because we tend to talk about kind of in the center here, you can see Aldborough and Dunwich. That tends to be what we focus on here at Bacchus Page House Museum. But everything in bold on this map is what Talbot settled. That's the land he placed people on with their land grants. And that's at one point 29 townships and different towns. And then there's, of course, there's this one up here. So Tyrconnell is here and Port Talbot's right here along the lake. So we're just beside that circle of Tyrconnell. The museum's not quite in the little town. So it goes from, actually it includes cities now like London, St. Thomas, Woodstock, Sarnia, Chatham, Windsor, and much more. We describe our township, Dunwich, as the heart of the Talbot settlement because the estate's here and Colonel Talbot is buried here. It ended up that Colonel Talbot oversaw the construction of 480 kilometers of road that runs along Lake Erie. And the road linked the Detroit River and Lake Ontario. And because Talbot did his work so well, along with his helpers, surveyors, and the settler duty rules, the government placed the entire southwestern part under his charge. So he starts out with just land here in Aldborough, Dunwich, and then they slowly add Orford, Howard, Harwich, and then he just gets to be in charge of all of this. So he ends up extending the road from the Long Point region, which is over here, right to the Detroit River. So this is a large grouping of land for one man to be in charge of. And I'm sure there'll be more questions later. So we can always come back to this map. But one thing I wanted to mention, as people, I love genealogy. So as people do their family history, they may have settlers that start here in Dunwich and Aldborough, but often what happens is the second or third generation, you'll see that they move west. And that's because Colonel Talbot would give the sons or the grandsons land in Orford, Howard, Harwich, Raleigh. He would move them west, and they would then be the person that you would send the settlers to learn how to farm, to learn how to clear the land, just to learn how to live here if they weren't familiar with how to, they came from a city in Europe or they just had never started a farm before. So it's really interesting to watch family trees as they move along. There are some families where they don't want to do that, but he promises the farmer more land if they'll go to these 4 sections or farther west. After time, teaches all the settlers, and then he'll give them larger land grants and they can come back to live in Dunwich or Aldborough. So he did think ahead how to have these stars of the settlement go to different areas and teach and clear that land. So yeah, I think he had a good system in mind. All right, so on the left is the entire township of Dunwich. Now this is after the railroad goes through, so it's 1872, but Port Tyrconnell's down here. We're missing part of this. This is Wallacestown, named after William Wallace. So if you were Scottish, you're actually all up in here near the Thames River. So he would give you land above, this is Highway 3 going through. That's where the Scottish people were given their land. Irish and English are all down here, closer to Colonel Talbot. I've mentioned Little Ireland and Tyrconnell, and that's our 4 founding families along this road. They're the 4 that we talk about the most. They come in 1809. So here you've got John Pierce and his wife, Frances Patterson. I lost my cursor. There it is. This land that says Andrew Bacchus, originally that's Mary Story's land. So she's one of the other families. This little square is actually the Bacchus Page House Museum, which is kind of fun. Beside Mary Story's land is Captain Leslie Patterson that I mentioned earlier. And then beside him and his wife is Stephen Bacchus, and he marries Mary Story's daughter, and his sister is Lydia Patterson. So these 4 families are all related. They come from Ireland. So Colonel Talbot loved them because they were Irish Anglican, just like he was. And they tend to be the stars of the settlement that we discuss quite a bit. They come from Ireland. They settle first in Baltimore, Maryland, because they also want to grow hemp and flax. Flax is their main crop because they're weavers, and you can take flax, comb it, spin it, and make it into linen, just like you would with sheep's wool. But they all get sick. They're not used to the climate, warm, humid down there in Baltimore, Maryland. So they move up to Pennsylvania at doctor's orders. And then they really decide they want to live under British rule. So they move to the Talbot settlement and arrive in 1809. And because they're family, they're all interrelated, they get land all in a row. And there is a road, as I mentioned earlier, there was a lake road that gets you to these 4 farms. So it would be along here, but it's gone. It's in the lake now. But one of the houses still stands, and the front of it is facing the lake. So they, of course, do all their settler duties. They get more and more land. You'll see up here more John Pierce land. There's some more, Bacchus in there. There's a Bobier. That's my husband's family. So these are the Irish Anglican settlers that we have in our section. And they bring with them a boat. So they take a boat along the edge of Lake Erie, because it would never be recommended, even now, to just go straight across the lake. The weather will turn on you in an instant, and you would not want to do that. So they skirt the edge of Lake Erie to come around to the settlement. And one person is on the land moving their livestock along. In the boat, they've got their looms, their spinning wheels, everything they would need to start a farm. And again, Colonel Talbot loves them because they've already had to start fresh twice. Now, on the other hand, we do, and I'm part Scottish, so don't think that I agree with Colonel Talbot whatsoever in this instant. After the War of 1812, 1816 to 1818 and 19, a large group of Scottish settlers. They come from New York. They come from the Red River settlement, and we've got a podcast on that. That's a whole story in itself. And a large group comes from Argyllshire, Scotland, and they're all interrelated. They come out here. They did not like Talbot. He charged them higher fees for their land deeds than any of the other settlers. He kept more land than he was supposed to. So he only gave them 50 acres, not the full 200, and he would keep the other 150 and just add it to his, what we call now the Talbot estate. That wasn't what he was supposed to do, but he found a loophole in the paperwork from the British government, and that's how he amassed all his land. If he gave a certain amount away to a settler, he kept some in another area. So he placed these Scottish settlers in Aldborough, which is now the municipality of West Elgin. And like I said on the other map, North Dunwich. He's said to have ruled all the settlers, regardless of where they were from, just like the Irish aristocrat that he was. That's how he was raised. He knew no other way of acting. And when the government learned of how he was running the land grants, they initially refused to grant him more land to give out, but he submitted his plan, he submitted his ideas, and there was a signed statement that the settlers were listed on their land and there was nothing anyone could do about it. So they just had to go with how he was running things. And he was in with all the people at the government. He was friends, he was part of the family compact that was running the legislature at Toronto. So there's nothing that they could be doing. There was a lot of controversy because he kept the entire original 5,000 acres and then put all the settlers outside of that. And then he never did grow hemp. And that was his original idea. I think they tried it for a couple of years and then it didn't work. So by 1821, he had 186 settlers and over 40,000 acres that he was in charge of. So we do have some watercolors of Port Talbot. By 1836, his activity with land, it's not land speculation, but his land ideas, was slowly coming to an end. And at that point, his assessment was that he had settled 500,000 acres, which is about 3,000 lots, and he had a population of 50,000 people. The next year, they show that he placed settlers in 27 townships, which went from Long Point to the Detroit River. And he never married, which is always a topic of conversation. He never had children that we know of. Because of this, in the 1830s, he asks his nephew, Julius Erie, to come from Ireland to come and live with him. And Julius and his family, they just thought it was too isolating because they were used to Dublin and being in London, England. So in 1843, Talbot asked his other nephew, Colonel Richard Erie, to come and live with him, and he promised to transfer him all the land when he died. When the Erie family arrived, they basically displaced Talbot out of his house. Talbot went back to England for a visit, England and Ireland. And while he was gone, Richard Erie and his wife renovated his house. They're the ones that put on the additions. And when Colonel Talbot came back, it just wasn't the same place. They were gone for almost a year. I mean, you couldn't just pop over for a couple weeks. And when they got back, they were really upset. Richard was also jealous of Colonel Talbot's servant, George Macbeth. That was an issue quite a bit. And neither of them felt that their positions were secure, Richard Erie versus George Macbeth. So Talbot gave Richard half the estate. He gave George Macbeth the other half. And then he left for England again in 1850, stayed for another year. He got sick there. His health was declining. And once he got home, he realized his nephew, Richard, had just left. So now there's no heir. Richard had just rented out the Talbot's house to someone local. So Talbot and Macbeth went to London, and that's where they stayed for 2 or 3 years until Colonel Talbot passes away. So he actually passes away in London in a house that George Macbeth had bought. One of the pictures is fuzzy. So on February 9th, 1853, Colonel Talbot does pass away, and he's 83 at the time. He's in London, and he's buried just down the street from where I'm sitting right now in St. Peter's Anglican Church Cemetery. Now, he did contribute a bit of money to the church. The church is part of what originally was Mary Story's parcel of land that I showed you on the map. That also includes our museum, the provincial park that we're in, which is John E. Pierce Provincial Park, and a couple privately owned houses now. But when they asked Colonel Talbot to contribute to the building of the church, Mary Story gave her land for that church and some money. I believe he gave 25 pounds, and the settlers were very upset. They thought he shouldn't even have bothered giving them money if that's all he was going to give them. So he also apparently was frugal, which I say nicely. Probably was cheap. We know that Colonel Talbot really wanted to do good, and his aspirations were to be benevolent, but he lacked humility. I think he never thought he did anything wrong. And that's where part of the title for my talk, Benevolent Despot, is there. I do need to tell the story of moving Colonel Talbot's body, because I think it's funny, but also it's very disrespectful in my opinion too, but it's kind of funny. There was some miscommunication in the arrangements. So when he passes away on February 9th, the story is that they basically put his body in a wagon, and this is the undertaker with some helpers. They put his body in a wagon in London, and they head out, and they end up in Fingal, where they need to stay the night. So the arrangement was that they would just put his body in the barn, which is also the granary of Mr. Lewis's inn in Fingal. The old settlers were just horrified that that's what the Undertaker was doing. And I wish somebody said who the Undertaker was, because I think he needs to be taken to task. They were just horrified. So one of the sons of an old settler, Mr. Samuel Burwell, he was, it says, with tears in his eyes, begged to let them take the body to his own house. And another settler, Mr. Partridge, would have done the same. So they're offered that please let us take him to his house, our house, wash him, do all the prep for the burial. And the innkeeper offered the best room in the house for this, and the Undertaker would not do that. Now, I must admit that the Undertaker and assistants had stopped for refreshments. It says here they were intoxicated, so I think they just didn't care. They did allow the corpse to be removed from the hearse, and they put it in the granary because they wouldn't let it go to another house. And that's what happened for the night. I think it's horrible, disrespected. No one thinks it was intentional, but yeah, I just think it's horrible. So the following day, they removed Colonel Talbot from Fingal to his house at Port Talbot. Of course, they have a wake, and the mourners assemble, and it is February, so apparently it was not great weather. The funeral procession goes from Port Talbot here to the cemetery. It's followed by sleighs with George Macbeth, H.G. Beecher, the Honorable G. Goodhue, L. Lorison, James Hamilton, J.B. Askin. These are all esquires, and some others of the most respectable men in London, and other gentlemen from different parts of the settlement. The funeral service, of course, is Church of England, and it's performed by the Reverend Mr. Holland in St. Peter's Anglican Church here at Tyrconnell. And then across the road from the church is the grave. And you can go there. We have people walk that cemetery probably daily. It's beautiful. If you get to the back, you can see the lake. And originally the top of the stone just said Thomas Talbot, founder of the Talbot settlement, died 9th of February, 1853. There is a lot more written on there. We are discussing how much it needs. Oh, it says February 5th. Weird. Okay, I need to check that date. I think maybe the burial's on the 9th, and he's actually passed on the 5th or 6th. But since I'm looking at this fuzzy picture, we are talking about getting money to restore the top of Colonel Talbot's grave, because there is quite a bit now written there, so that you can see more information about him when you go to St. Peter's Church. We do have a winding sheet in our collection, and the story is that in Fingal, one of the merchants did come out and at least wind Colonel Talbot in this linen that came from Ireland, from the Blackwood family, and that's what he was wrapped in to go from Fingal to Port Talbot when they actually prepped him for burial. So we have that winding sheet. It is a story, but we do have letters for the history of it, and it is on display in our Colonel Talbot room. Now, over the years, the villages, the towns, the cities, they've all grown. The county lines have changed. Townships have been amalgamated. So the map that we had shown before of the Talbot settlement, all those lines have changed a bit, but that is still the area that we had and that we talk about as being the Talbot settlement. His legacy, we've got there's been farmers, politicians, business people, all come from this area. And just recently, if you follow any space news, the Canadian astronaut, whose first name escapes me, I think it's Jeremy Hansen, while he was born in London, his parents are from Wallacestown. So now we have an astronaut that has come from settlers of the Talbot settlement, which is fantastic. Colonel Talbot really coveted land and wealth and power. And to achieve his goals, he used methods that maybe were a little devious. Like I said, he found some loopholes, and he rode roughshod over anyone who stood in his way. But the one thing is that he was never accused of being dishonest during all the years of handling large sums of money. So you may, especially if you're Scottish, look at him and think this was not okay how he treated people. But you also have to admit that he got things done. We have a great road system. And a lot of us are really working to keep the history of the area alive. And that's what we do. Oh, there he is right now. I think this is part of, I think it's a similar picture to the one at the front. This is, I'm going to make sure I have the name. Wansford, James Buckingham Wansford is the artist. And there's the quote that I mentioned at the beginning, but it was the concern of a benevolent despot who believed that he had a divine mandate to rule in the best interests of the people. And that's from the Lake Erie Baron, the story of Colonel Thomas Talbot by Fred Coyne Hamill. That I read that book late teens, I think. And that's when I really realized where I came from and where I lived. I heard things as I was a kid, but I think that's one of the best books to read, along with Edward Ermatager's book about the Talbot settlement. Those two are fantastic. And Ermatager's is actually written, he actually interviews Talbot, so his is very early. Those two are great to look at. And yeah, so we're back at Bacchus Page House. This is, I don't know, I should just live here. It's my baby. Let's go with that. I don't have kids, so the museum's my baby. The house is built in 1850, just so you have a little background. And Andrew and Mary Jane Bacchus are second generation settlers. So you can see what happens as farms progress from a little log cabin to, you've got a full 2-story brick home. We'd love to have you come and visit. I could talk to you for hours about everything that happens around here and the history in different areas. But everything's period room settings. And we do try and be pre-1860, but because we're the community's museum, we do have items that are outside of that time period, but they're really related to the history here. And we also have a 3,000 square foot agricultural center. So we've got quite a bit of farming history because of course we're an agricultural area out there. And I have not included pictures of, other than this one over here where I'm talking about our top hat bathtub, because I do want people to come and visit. So I didn't want to share interior photos of the house or the agricultural center. But the house is run by Tyrconnell Heritage Society, and they were incorporated in 1994. So next year we'll be celebrating our 30th anniversary, and we're inside Johnny Pierce Provincial Park. So if you can come and visit, there's walking trails. There's a wetlands walking trail that we've named after Mary Story because this was her land. And if you come in July and August, the church down the road, St. Peter's, is usually open for tours as well. So you can visit the church that was put up in 1827, and of course go across the street and see the graves of our early settlers, plus Colonel Thomas Talbot and his assistant, George Macbeth, is also buried there beside him. We do have a podcast. So if there's more information you want, you can listen to, I think we're over 50 episodes now. Just pop into Spotify, type in Life in the Talbot Settlement, and you can find us and listen there. And we do have a YouTube channel as well. And just look up Bacchus Page House Museum. What we do with the podcast is we put a slideshow with them. So you can also listen and watch the podcast on YouTube. And I would be remiss if I didn't show our mission statement from Tyrconnell Heritage Society: to preserve and promote the history, the culture, and area surrounding Bacchus Page House within the Talbot settlement for the greater community and future generations while understanding the past. That word understanding is new in there. It used to be celebrating the past, and we realized that not all history should be celebrated. Some of it is sad, some of it is just scary, some of it just not something we'd put up with now in modern times. So I've temporarily switched it to understanding, but I am open to other word ideas that could be there. So submit those if you've got some other ideas. And we're at the point where I'll take questions and answer anything you want to know after I take a drink.
Thank you so much, Angela. I'm just going to remind everybody on our YouTube channel that there is a bit of a delay. It seems more significant today. So between what we're seeing here in the studio, as we like to call it, and what's happening on YouTube. So sometimes people post questions, and by the time they pop up, we've kind of moved on. Or as happened earlier in your talk, somebody posts a question, and then we've already heard the answer, but they haven't seen it yet. So somebody asked why was Talbot's house torn down? And of course, we'd already heard the answer, but that hadn't got that far yet. So if I skip that question, you'll know why. And also, I did want to say, for your benefit, there's a really fascinating discussion on lots of different topics happening in the chat. So we'll try to share that with you. Some people sharing. So Tom and I will share that with you. Some people sharing family histories, but also some really interesting further information on Colonel Erie, which is kind of neat.
Yes. I didn't even go on that tangent, but he's very interesting separately. Yes.
Yeah. So lots of that got shared. So I'd like, sort of starting with the bigger one. I think we can all imagine what your answer will be. But just to kind of put a fine point on it, the term benevolent despot. Do you think that is a absolutely fair title? Do you think that's how you yourself would describe Talbot?
Yeah, when I came across that quote, that I thought that is the perfect way to describe him, actually. So that's how I titled the talk, is I happened upon that quote. And I think the benevolent part probably I've mentioned, but the fact that you could stay with him for a few months and learn, I guess, the ropes of being a new settler, or he may place you with another farmer in the area as things got going, but you could stay with him, and you were working. He knew why the settler duties were the way they were. How he did it might have been harsh, and that's the despot part, is kind of tyrannical, but he had a reason, and the reason panned out in the end. He treated Irish, Anglican, and English people very well, and then of course he didn't treat the Scottish people well at all. So that's a benefactor versus a despot. So I think he's very complicated, but I think every person is. I think there's, I think you've all got two sides, and I hope I illustrated his two sides. The fact that he ended up leaving all of his land and acquirements to his servant versus any family member, that he clearly had two nephews come out and couldn't get along with either one. So he tried to be benevolent and leave them his estate, and then he couldn't deal with them.
So speaking of relationships, You've kind of alluded to how he got along with the indigenous population in his in the settlement. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more? I find it interesting that it seems to be a mostly positive relationship. Is that fair?
I think so. There's not, other than a couple of the things that I mentioned in my talk, I didn't find a lot of interactions between Talbot and the First Nations in our area. Unfortunately, before he even arrives here, we've already gone through McKee's Purchase, which is one of the early treaties. So the land from the Detroit River all the way to, I think it's Port Stanley. And I use the word purchase in the lightest way because they weren't given money. I believe the First Nations were given, I'd have to look up. I think it's 1,200 pounds worth of trade goods. So trade axes, pots and pans, like they were just given some stuff and signed away that land. So by the time Talbot's here in 1803, we do have, there's already the reservation area near Delaware, but people are moving around. I mean, nobody's stuck just in their reservation. So there are stories of some of the settlers learned how to do maple syrup from First Nations because First Nations would come out here along the lake, and that's where they would do their maple syrup. And that's how I know Jonas Page, who part of our museum is named after that family. That's how he learned his maple syrup seasonal work. But I do believe that when Talbot was with Simcoe, I think they had a fairly good relationship with the First Nations in the York and Grand River areas. And I think that carried on through here. And again, we're telling this from, Colonel Talbot is a settler person. We're telling that from his point of view. I don't know what at the time the First Nations thought of him arriving, settlers coming in. I'm sure it was maybe not great.
Yes, that's a nice point. So some questions from the chat. How was the settlement administered after he died?
Well, even while he's alive, you've already started getting county councils, township councils, much like we run today, actually. So while he's still alive, there's people being sent to Toronto to administer things. They're the equivalent of what we'd have as an MPP today, getting sent to the Upper Canada Parliament. So he slowly just kind of gets aged out, where once you've got the rebellions of 1837, when the family compact is slowly taken out of running everything politically, then Colonel Talbot is also taken out of that equation for being gone to for land grants. So he's just aged out, and then there's a central land grant system for the county and the townships.
Right. So speaking kind of that family compact, you did mention the sort of traditional requirement that there was land set aside for the Anglican Church. Was Talbot required at all to do any of that? Was any of his settlement set aside for? You mentioned that he tried to avoid it, but was any of that land used for that purpose?
Yeah. So originally there are clergy reserves pre Colonel Talbot and early 1800s, and he, because of his connections, I think he was able to move, if any of the clergy reserves that were in, let's say, just Dunwich and Aldborough, I think he was able to move them to different townships that he wasn't actively settling, so that the church still felt that they had their parcels of land, but he was able to develop as he wanted. So he was able to line up settlers side by side. And yeah, so we moved that. And I mean, here, there was no clergy reserve. I mean, Mary Story and her son Walter carved out part of their 200 acres for the church because they wanted it in their neighborhood. So yeah, there's still clergy reserves, but I think that's one of his loopholes, is he moves them to where he's not settling at the time.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
So the other side, you mentioned that obviously you never married, you never had any children that we know of. Are there rumors out there? Are there suggestions that there might be children, or are you just hedging your bets there?
I'm hedging my bets. Yeah, I mean, there's always rumors when somebody is single their entire lives. I mean, there's a rumor that as a teen or early 20s, he's disappointed in love, and that's why he comes out here to the wilderness instead of staying among the aristocracy. There's always rumors that perhaps he was gay. Nobody knows. I don't think anybody would care if he was. At the time, that would have been a problem, especially being in the military. I mean, that would have been very difficult in the military. So somebody has mentioned, well, maybe that's why he left the military and again came out to the wilds, the wilderness here. And we just don't know. So I'm always hedging my bets on the children aspect, because you just don't know what people were doing. Nobody left me a diary with any shenanigans they got up to that we don't know about. Yeah, but we do know that his siblings in Ireland and England, they had children, and yeah, so he does have family, just probably not direct descendant from him.
Right. Thank you. So 2 more questions from the chat, but I'm only going to ask you one, and then I'll put the other one off, and I'll tell you why in just a second. But I'm going to read this one entirely because I'm not quite sure how to paraphrase it. So Laurie says, Talbot was instrumental in opening up settlement in the middle of Essex County in the 1830s, both along the Talbot Road West and the Middle Road, which is County Road 46 today. Can you contribute any thoughts on that development?
Ooh, I'm not up on my Essex County. I would think probably what has happened, and I'm guessing here, because like I said, I'm not up on Essex County. It would work the same. So he would have this, I mean, it didn't matter that you were going to be in Essex, you still had to go to his house and get put on the map. So everybody was going to Port Talbot for that. And my guess would be also, if we looked at some of the family last names, that you might see earlier settlers from our section of Elgin County that then, like I said about Chatham-Kent, perhaps there's some Chatham-Kent families that then they sent the next generation, or Talbot sent them and said, hey, you're doing well here. Can you go to Essex? And you're going to be the star of that settlement, that little neighborhood, and teach everyone how to settle there. So yeah, if I was more up on Essex County, I could better answer, but I can't imagine it wouldn't work. It'd have the same settler duties as well, all the same rules.
As you keep saying, fascinating genealogy, right? That sort of skipping along. So the last question, as I say, I'm gonna leave it for another time. So it is, what Talbot artifact does the museum have with the most interesting story? And I'm going to ask you not to answer that one because I'm hoping that maybe Tom and I can get to the museum and we can do another video maybe over the summer or something like that with a great artifact story I have a whole room.
Yeah, I have a whole Talbot room now, so we can do the whole room.
Fantastic.
Excellent.
Fantastic. So I'm just, before I turn it over to Tom, I'm going to say thank you so much. This is a fascinating part of Southwestern Ontario history that I really didn't know enough about. So thank you so much for sharing that story with us today.
You're welcome.
And back to Tom.
All right. Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Angela, and all our audience that joined us today. Lots of
good interaction in the chat. I've copied
Awesome.
that for you, Angela. I will email you
Great.
the transcript of the chat, and you can check that out too. So, hey, keep following us and what we're doing. We'll be posting different videos, more uploads through the months between now and September, and as soon as we can, we will communicate out our fall schedule. So appreciate everyone's support. Thank you so much, and we'll talk again real soon.